Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to say a few words about a longtime friend and colleague of mine, Casey Seiler. Casey will introduce our guest and do the moderating duties tonight and the interviewing. Casey is the editor of the Times-Union, as I'm sure you all know. Previously at the paper, he was managing editor, Capitol Bureau chief, and entertainment editor. He's also a longtime contributor and former host of WMHT's weekly political roundtable, New York Now. And also it's a treat to open the Sunday paper each Sunday and see his witty, droll, often sardonic takedowns of our state politicians and dysfunctional Albany officialdom. So please welcome Casey Seiler.
Thanks to Paul for that kind introduction. We are speaking on the 166th anniversary today of the Times-Union's first publication. I looked at the front page today. It was half ads and half a romance novel, the first chapter of a romance novel. So this is appropriate that I am, closing down my day here celebrating the literary pedigree of this region, including the Hudson Valley. It is great to be connected to Paul Grandal and other great Times-Union employees such as William Kennedy, who is in so many ways the reason we are here hearing from an acclaimed novelist. So at a time when thinking in dystopian or apocalyptic terms is not only reasonable, but probably required as the proper response to the news of the day, blasting at us from smart TVs, smartphones, and smartwatches, there are few writers as necessary as tonight's guest, the acclaimed novelist and essayist Gary Shteyngart. He was born Igor Shteingart in Leningrad 2 decades before the city's name was changed back to St. Petersburg, the same birthplace, I would note, as that other acclaimed Russian/upstate American novelist, Vladimir Nabokov. Both sides of Steingart's family, no, I'm sorry, I was corrected by the author. On his father's side, he is Ukrainian. On his mother, Russian and Belarusian, correct? Okay. He was 7 when his family immigrated to Queens in 1979, a transition he recalls in his memoir, Little Failure, as, quote, equivalent to stumbling off a monochromatic cliff and landing in a pool of pure technicolor. A graduate of Stuyvesant High School in New York City and Oberlin College, as well as Hunter College's graduate writing program. Steingart's first novel, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, was published in 2002 to accolades including the Stephen Crane Award for First Fiction and the National Jewish Book Award. In 2006, his follow-up Absurdistan was selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. The best-selling Super Sad Love Story, a 2010 novel in which the science fiction elements have, alas, in the fullness of time, proven to be depressingly prescient, earned similar accolades as one of the best novels of that year and won the Bollinger Everyman Roadhouse Prize, the top UK award for comic literature. The aforementioned memoir, Little Failure, arrived in 2014, followed in 2018 by the road novel, Lake Success. The 2 titles, Failure and Success, give you a side-by-side look at the sense of the author's wickedly detailed attention to rising and falling in America and beyond. His latest novel, Our Country Friends, was published last fall, just a few weeks before the rise of the Omicron variant. I myself read it while recovering from COVID, appropriately enough. I'll let the author describe its plot himself, except to note that it was praised by Kirkus as, and I quote, the great American pandemic novel, capital TGAPN, only Shteingart could write, full of hyphenated identities, killer prose, and wild vitality. Writing in the New York Times, Molly Young called it, quote, a perfect novel for these times and all times. The single textual artifact from the pandemic era I would place in a time capsule as a representation of all that is good and true and beautiful about literature. I should pause here to note that the author himself is a promiscuous blurb writer whose collected short form works are collected at steingardblurbs.tumblr.com. Have you ever written a blurb that good? Okay, no is the answer. Steingart's nonfiction has appeared in numerous literary journals, as well as the New Yorker and the Times, which published his 2015 essay on the week he spent watching multiple screens of Russian TV while hunkered down at the Four Seasons Hotel. That piece might be quintessential Shteynggart, darkly funny, frequently self-revelatory, politically astute, and written in the sort of barbed prose that informs, amuses, and lacerates. It's a pleasure to welcome him back to the New York State Writers Institute for the first time since 2011. Please give a big hand to Gary Shteynggart. So for the order of the evening, you're going to read
Oh, okay, thank you. I don't know how to work a microphone.
You're going to read a little, is this on? Yes, good. Read a little bit from our country friends. We will chat for a while. We will leave the last act for questions from the audience, so please have them ready.
Ask me anything. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, Albany. Woo. Yeah. I love this place. You know, the Mid-Hudson Valley is probably my favorite part of the world right now. I spend half the year in the city suffering, and then I come up for half a year of enjoyment up here. And that half of a year starts very soon. So come on down to the Hudson, Rhinebeck, Kingston Triangle, and you shall find me where this book is set, actually. I'll just read a little from the beginning, I guess. Ooh, there we go. So, the house on the hill was in a tizzy. Wow, I just realized I completely stole that from Anna Karenina. Everything was topsy-turvy in the house of Oblomov. Oh my God. Oops, well. You know, what my teacher used to say, bad writers borrow, good writers steal. Yeah, that is true. All right, let me, I guess this whole book was stolen from just Chekhov and stuff, but I'll start again. The house on the hill was in a tizzy. Workmen's trucks streamed up the long gravel driveway. Two sets of plumbers from both sides of the river had been summoned to de-winterize the 5 bungalows behind the main house, and they did not care for one another. A broken set of windows in one bungalow had to be replaced post-haste, and a family of field mice had chewed through the electrical cable powering another. The handyman, who did not live on the property, was so overwhelmed by the state of affairs, he retreated to the extensive covered porch to eat a cheese sandwich in long, deliberative bites. The mistress of the house, Masha, had lowered the shades in her first floor office to escape the cacophony of modern tools and loud country cursing. At times, she would peek out to note the surfaces that would have to be wiped down after the workmen left. Natasha, who liked to go by Nat, her 8-year-old daughter, was upstairs, illuminated by a screen in the darkness of her room, in a lonely public world of her own. The only happy member of the household was Alexander Borisovich Senderovsky, known as Sasha to his friends. Happy, we should say, with an asterisk. He was agitated as well as excited. A windstorm had brought down the heavy branches of 2 dead trees flanking the driveway, scattering the vast front lawn with their dead white rot. Senderovsky liked to expound upon the entropic nature of his estate, the way all manner of growth was allowed to go in its own way. Sumacs elbowing out more well-heeled plants, ivy poisoning the perimeter, groundhogs bringing destruction upon the garden. But the scattering of dead tree limbs made the house on the hill look apocalyptic, the very thing Senderovsky's guests were coming up to escape. The handyman claimed a bad back and was not handy enough to remove all the tree limbs on his own, and the so-called tree guy had gone missing. Senderovsky, in his athletic pants and wildly colored dressing gown, had tried to move one of these prehistoric-looking branches himself, but the very first heave made him fear a hernia. "Oh, the hell with it," he said, and got into his car. A word about the car. Well, not so much about the car as the way in which it was driven. Senderovsky had only learned to drive 3 years ago at the advanced age of 45, and only within the limits of a country setting. The highway on the other side of the river unsettled him. He was a fiercely awful driver. The half-empty local roads inspired him to gun the engine of his sturdy but inflexible Swedish automobile, and he saw the yellow stripes bisecting the roads as suggestions meant for less experienced drivers, whoever that might be. Because he did not believe in road marks or certain aspects of relativity, the concept of a blind curve continued to elude him. His wife no longer allowed him to drive with their child on board. What was worse, he had somewhere picked up the phrase tooling around. And now Senderovsky raced to his errands mindful only of the speed traps set with boring predictability on the frayed edges of towns or the school zones where the fines could be doubled. First, he visited the butchers, two former catalog models from the city, now a husband and wife, who plied their trade out of a barn so red it verged on the patriotic. The two magnificent 25-year-olds, all teeth and coveralls, presented him with a wrapped parcel of sweet and Italian sausages, glistening hamburger patties, and his secret weapon, lamb steak, that clung to the bone, so fresh they could only have been rivaled by a restaurant Senderovsky admired in Rome's abattoir district. The very sight of meat for tomorrow's cookout inspired in him a joy that in a younger man could be called love. Not because of the meat itself, but because of the conversation that would flow around it as it was marinated, grilled, and served, despite the growing restrictions on such closeness. By noon tomorrow, his best friends, the ones who had been so hard to bring together during previous summers, would finally unite, brought together by the kernels of a growing tragedy, to be sure, but brought together nonetheless in his favorite place on earth, the house on the hill. Of course, someone else was coming too. Someone who was not a friend. Someone who made Senderovsky, already a drinker, drink still more. With that in mind, he sped to the liquor store in the richest village in the district, which occupied the premises of a former church. He bought 2 cases of Austrian Riesling at the south transept, another of Rosé at the north, along with a 4th case of Beaujolais, wildly out of season, but a nostalgic wine for him and his high school friends, Vinud and Karen. His friend Ed, as always, would be the hardest to accommodate. Deep in the sacristy, Senderovsky picked out an 18-year-old bottle of something beyond his means, 2 bottles each of cognac and rye, and to show his frivolous side, schnapps and a strange single malt from Tyrol. The proprietor, a shaggy Anglo with rosea nose picking out from his loosely worn mask, looked very pleased as he rang up the many purchases, his fingers clad in black disposable gloves. Just got a call from the state, he said to Senderovsky. They might shut me down any day now for being non-essential. Senderovsky sighed and bought an extra case of the Riesling and 2 bottles of an artisanal gin he had never heard of. He could picture his friend Ed pursing his lips around a glass and pronouncing it drinkable. When the final bill, adding up to just over 4 digits, meandered out of the machine in many long spurts, Senderovsky's hand could barely slalom through his signature. It's a special occasion, he told himself. With his trunk now filled with bottles as well as meats, he gunned his car toward yet another village, this one 15 miles north, to do some more marketing, after which he was due to drop off the meat and pick up Ed from the station. At the exit for the bridge crossing the river, he ran into a line of cars. Nothing irritated Senderovsky more than the local version of a traffic jam. He brought a city impatience to the rural life. Around here, it was considered impolite to honk, but Senderovsky honked. He rolled down his window, thrust out his long bony face, and honked some more with the palm of his hand, the way he had seen men do in films. The car in front of him was not moving. It sat low to the ground, a rusted wheelbarrow jammed into its trunk, a national flag fluttering from the driver's window, and a partly peeled sticker on the bumper that read, "I stand by my prez." And I'll end there. Thank you.
So among the many killer details there are the proprietors of, I believe, the butcher shop who are former catalog models.
Yes.
I guess, can you speak a little bit about your Dutchess County experience?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's obviously the setting of this novel, and it is where you yourself kind of hunkered down through the opening months of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I've been living up there. I'm not we, my wife and child have been living there for about 12 years. About half the time there and half the time in the city, in New York City. I hate saying the city. That sounds so presumptuous. God, people. But I remember giving a reading for Lake Success, my previous novel, about 4 years ago in Rhinebeck, and I said, you know, I've always wanted to write a novel set up here. And this woman got up and said, until you live here full time, don't you dare write about us, you carpetbagger, you know. And I really took that. That's how people speak in Rhinebeck. It's a tough town. And I took that to heart. And so I didn't write about it until the pandemic forced me to actually spend a year there. And then I said, all right, I'm qualified now to do this. And I really began to feel like a real upstate New Yorker, although I know upstate is a contested term. Some people believe it starts in Plattsburgh or something, but I think it begins where I am, wherever I am at the time, that's upstate.
You are a walking,
I'm a walking
avatar of upstate.
I am the walking. So today it starts right here and then goes north toward Canada. But yeah, I remember, and then all of a sudden during the pandemic, half of Brooklyn began to move upstate. So I remember getting my my license renewed at the DMV in Kingston, and this woman came out and was like screaming, like, "If you're from Brooklyn, go home." You know? And that was one of my favorite pandemic moments. But they did not go home. They persisted. Yeah.
So it's my understanding that you began this novel after completing more than 200 pages of, I'm sorry, am I bringing up a sore subject?
It's sore, but
Okay,
go ahead,
right.
speak.
But a dystopian novel in which NYU takes over half of Manhattan.
All of Manhattan.
All of Manhattan.
All of Manhattan.
And
Yeah.
I mean, why did you jettison that, at least temporarily, in favor of this?
Well, the novel, first of all, wasn't going that great, I have to say. I mean, there's only so many academic jokes one could make, and many of them have been made before, but I thought I could get away with it. And just the idea of, I teach at Columbia, but I'm at NYU land. I mean, NYU students throw up on my porch the whole day long, and they're lovely and so young and great. But I thought I would take it to the next. Also, they bought up all the real estate around us. Everything's got a violet flag. And I thought I would take it to the next level. They would have their own like mercenary force, you know, the violet helmets. Yes, it was that stupid. But then, you know, when the pandemic started, and I have written dystopian works before. You mentioned Super Sad True Love Story. This felt more like a real dystopian tragedy that was happening, and my little academic dystopia began to seem a little silly by comparison. And so I turned it aside, and I thought, how does one write about it while it's happening? And then I was asked by the New Yorker to write a short nonfiction piece, about 2 pages about, they asked a bunch of writers, Laurie Moore, et cetera, to do little pieces about it. And I wrote about it, and you know, it was the first time I had written about nature, because I was upstate. There was nothing to do, you know, there was no one to drink with. This was a huge problem. So all of my friends and I, we started getting these apps on the phone, you know, like, oh, this is an elm tree, and this is that's a squirrel. Okay, you know. And so I began to think, all right, maybe I can write about, because I did this nonfiction piece for the New Yorker. People seemed to like it. I thought, all right, you know, what if I began to write about that? And interestingly enough, I was interviewed by my friend Fred Savage. Do you know, remember him from the Wonder Years? What a cutie, yeah. And he, in LA, and he was saying that this is the first book I've written where there's actual silences instead of just immigrants screaming at each other, which is my usual shtick. So, yeah, this is my most sort of nature-y book, but also living there for a year and wanting to write about. I mean, I do love the present moment. I think I don't love what's happening, but I'm saying as a writer, there's definitely a lot to chew on, and a lot of what I write has always been about, because I come from one failed superpower and I'm now living in a failing superpower. These sorts of gigantic cataclysmic events, including the political events that preceded even the pandemic, those things inspire me to sit down and start typing.
But that causes me to jump ahead in my list to note that for me, one of the most kind of affecting passages in the book, which, you know, contains a lot of humor, but also you know, a fair amount of tragedy and sadness. But one of my favorite passages was the description of how Sendrowski, the protagonist, and the other members of the party take in the killing of George Floyd, and especially the way that it hits Sendrowski as, you know, an immigrant himself, the son of immigrants, and to see the involvement of, you know, the children of immigrants who are among the police around George Floyd as he's killed, and it's an example of a really elegant tightrope walk that you make in the book around mortal issues, political issues.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I didn't set out thinking that there were going to be elements of, say, the social justice movement in this book. Maybe a little, because obviously this is set in 2020, but it was going to be more of like, I mean, the major influence for me really was the Chekhovian novels of, you know, well, not novels, sorry, the stories and plays that Chekhov writes, which half of them are set in the countryside, and it's all about, you know, middle-aged people getting together and be like, oh, I hate how I didn't lead my life well, I screwed it all up. Here I am 50, I'm a country doctor, I should be an actor on the stage in Petersburg or whatever. So that was the big inspiration. They're always sitting around the banya and flogging themselves with birch leaves, and that's kind of how I roll too. So that was the major inspiration, but I think, you know, it was impossible. That was such a tumultuous year. This year is also, 22 is also becoming quite tumultuous, obviously, with the war and everything, but there were so many things happening, and the idea of who we were as immigrants, the fact that we're sort of brought here to succeed, and then, you know, some of these things made us question sort of, well, what role do we play in all of this? We're no longer just newcomers, you know. Since coming to Upstate, I learned how to drive a car, just like Sasha, and I'm as bad as he is, but I feel like that's almost a different stage in becoming an American, you know, when you're, now I drive to the mall in Kingston and I buy the family-sized Charmin and I stuff it into my trunk, and that feels very American, and you save a lot of money, and it's incredible. We don't have that in the city. You go to the bodega, you get ripped off, you know. So I felt like, you know, I began to reconsider what my relationship to this country is, because in some ways I never really did feel American. You feel like, oh, I'm a New Yorker, you know, and that becomes okay. When I go abroad to flog my books, you know, they ask me, oh, how do you identify as a, you know, as a Russian, a Jew, an American? I always say, kind of a New Yorker, you know, but I think some of the events of those years, especially during the last administration, really focused one's mind on, you know, what role one plays throughout all of these events. And that begins to, all the characters in the book, most of the characters in the books are immigrants. Or I'm sorry, wait, yeah, immigrants, yeah, became 7, 8, 9 years old. I went to a Stuyvesant High School, which was all immigrants all the time. All my friends were immigrants. Yeah, I don't think I have any native-born friends. But we were all sort of navigating the country together. So, but the question of our place in this country is one of the things that this book discusses. And the other thing, I'll stop soon, but the other thing is that one of the characters says, you know, our parents escaped whatever country they're from, Russia or parts of, you know, Korea or India, but, you know, they brought us here because it would be safe here. But now we don't feel safe. We no longer feel like, you know, especially as COVID was starting in this country, you know, we don't that sense of safety that they sought is no longer really on the menu here. So those were all sort of the questions circling around.
The character of Sendrowski clearly has sort of points of connection to you. Yeah. And I just wonder, is it easier or at least more comfortable for you, and maybe for, you know, your family and friends to read it and for you to compose it, because so many of your personal cards, as it were, have been laid on the table, whether through your memoir or any of your first person, you know, your extensive you know, collection of first person work.
Yeah, I mean, look, the post-Soviet Jewish male, I own that. That's mine. It is definitely harder to do, you know, well, and again, even there, so I will only write about groups that I'm very familiar with. Korean Americans, my wife's Korean American, my kids, I guess, half Korean. My mentor was Korean American, Chang-Rae Lee, the wonderful writer. Many of my friends are, and the same, so a lot of my friends are also Gujarati that I grew up with. So that I feel like, you know, or Tamil, those two parts of India, I feel like I have some, and I've been there many times, and I've been to Korea many times. So I feel like those things I can sort of handle, but I can't, you know, even a little bit off of that map, and I already feel myself in more unfamiliar territory. Yeah, I always do like having a Steingartian kind of strange avatar who's always wearing the wrong clothes and flopping around. And for that, I channel my inner early Gary, the guy that was stumbling off the Technicolor cliff when he got here. Because in some ways, I do feel maybe I'm a little too comfortable here now, so I need to create a more comic version of myself to set.
You get worried if you ever got too comfortable here that the wellspring of your fiction might.
Yeah. Well, let's see how the next election goes. I can be living in Dublin by 2024 or something. No, I don't know. I do find life to be very interesting, and partly it's, as I was saying before, writing about crises it comes very naturally to me, given that I moved here at a very early age from a place that was falling apart, and in some ways, the fact that people are saying, "Why are you writing a pandemic novel? It'll be over in a couple of months and nobody will want to read about it." And I was like, it's not going to be over. and I was kind of right about that, but I think there's that writing about fiction is going to be writing about one crisis after another, environmental crisis, political, social. I mean, it's not going to end. You think this is the end? So I think in a way we have to write, for those of us who aren't writing historical fiction, which I love in its own thing, but I could never write historical fiction. I am addicted to the present, maybe a little bit of the future, which is the present, but worse. But that's really my where I get my paycheck from, and that means really keeping your ears and eyes and every other sensory apparatus open and trying to understand what's happening in the world. And now, I didn't expect that this year would bring a catastrophe in the part of the world in which I'm from. Thank you for mentioning the 2 Ukrainian grandparents. I feel certainly much closer to them at this point than everyone else. It's, this is just, as I said, I was so intent on becoming the American who drives to the mall and stuffs all that incredible bathroom tissue into the trunk. But, just when I thought I was out, the Soviet Union pulls me back in with the tragedy that Russia is perpetuating.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think that, with your Ukrainian heritage on your father's side, Russian heritage on your mother's side, the fact that you are a Jewish writer living at the time when, a very Soviet-style Russian leader is trying to use the denazification of Ukraine to go after a government led by a sovereign elected Jewish president. Yeah. I mean, that's got to hit you in about seven different ways all at once.
No, it's astounding because my grandfather was born in Western Ukraine, not far from Lviv, and he was a young man. He went up to Leningrad, where he met my grandmother, who was also from that part of Ukraine, and they fell in love. They had my father, and he was sent to fight in the war against the Nazis, and he was killed in battle because they were completely underarmed. The Soviets, like the Russians, don't really know how to field an army successfully until really push comes to shove, and he was killed. And this is the amazing thing. So a Ukrainian was killed defending Leningrad from Nazis. And then 10 years after his death, another fascist, Vladimir Putin, was born in exactly the same city that the Ukrainian, died defending. Sorry, it's a hell of a mind loop there, but absolutely shocking, and also to have Putin associated with my city, which I've always loved. I mean, I've always had complicated feelings about Russia, but I always thought of St. Petersburg, Leningrad as being this beautiful, fairly progressive city, et cetera. But the locus of all this evil now is coming directly from there. It's not just Putin; his whole retinue is from that city. And actually, he grew up not far from where I grew up as well. It's not the best part of town.
I mean, is that as you're contemplating? I don't know what you're working on next.
I am. That's
You are.
Yeah, I'm a glutton for punishment. Yeah.
So it is what you're working on now is sort of bound up in this current moment of
some of it. Yeah, it also concerns media, the way media. It's also a bit of an espionage tale with this young woman who falls under the auspices. She's trying to make her way in media in New York, and she falls under an outfit that looks almost too good to be true. Very well. as a journalist, you probably, it's like Substack on steroids, but there's something not quite right about that, and there may be a certain power behind it. So
Current day or slightly ahead of?
slightly ahead.
Okay.
Slightly ahead.
That sounds good.
I'm actually, so I'm interviewing all the characters, a young woman, probably late 20s, working in media. So for the last 3 months, I've just been going out drinking with these young women working in media. Good Lord, they can drink. I mean, I try to bring my Russian game to it, but I just crawl home. Cheers, young women in media. I think they're depressed.
And so you are about almost exactly, I guess, 20 years into your career. Is that right?
From the publication, yeah. But it took,
Yes, but you had been working on it.
I worked on that
Yeah.
book. I went to the Oberlin Institute for Special Individuals, little school in Ohio, and I started the book there, but I didn't feel good about it. I don't know, it was the same book I ended up publishing, but I think, as my psychiatrist would tell me, that I was worried that my parents would be mortally offended by it. And they were, it's part of the fun. But I think that's what kept it from many years of not being published. But yes, it came out in 2002. Yeah. And boy, did my life change. That was a nice book. Yeah. I mean, for me, not for my readers, but
your publication since then, it's been almost every 4 or 5 years you have had.
4 years, every 4 years.
Right,
Yeah.
every 4 years.
Yeah.
And I mean, do you feel that's just sort of the rhythm of
Yeah,
how you
yeah.
produce? So
I've always thought for some reason that I would write 12 novels and then I would die, and this is 6. This is really midpoint.
Yeah.
So another,
so far so good.
so far so good. I'm okay. But yeah, 6 novels by 4 years. So 74 will be my final year here. Goodbye in advance. Thank you for reading.
So getting back to our country friends, the time scheme, it sort of ends in the fall of 2020. And I was just wondering why did you think that was sort of the best moment to kind of put a pin, at least in this story? In other words, we all kind of, the great thing about the book is it brings back how strange those first couple of months were. And I was just wondering why did you want to wrap it up there? Because of course the pandemic went on for so long. Friends can only live together probably for so long.
Friends can only live, and also and this is something I noticed about my books, that I'm obsessed with summer, and all of my books, well, not all, but many begin in the beginning, or spring, and then end right before the cold weather sets in. I don't know why that is. In fact, this new book I'm trying to write is set in the dead of winter, during a very cold winter, but for some reason I come alive during the summer. I really do. But also there were a lot of other things. So I wrote this really quickly, and this is contemporaneous because by September I was almost finished with the first draft. But I was writing, without giving away too many plot elements, but I was writing about somebody who was very ill. And then I myself became insanely medically damaged. I don't want to get too into it, but just Google Shteyngart botched circumcision, New Yorker, and you can read a nice article about my time of troubles.
I've got a question about later.
You got a question? That's nice. That's great. But what happened was that I was put on this drug that was supposed to disconnect nerve endings from my spinal column. But it caused all of these hallucinations. So I was completely hallucinating and trying to finish this novel in which my character was hallucinating. So I would hallucinate for the first part of the day, kind of flop around the bed, and then try to get 2 or 3, hours of when the drug would ebb before I would take it at night, and it would start up again. So in some ways, that was a lot of serendipity there. I mean, I was in hell, but so was my character. So
did you ever look at those pages and say, whoa, what did I do?
My editor did some of that.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a good editor. He's like, well, dolphins don't fly. We'll take that out and stuff like that. It looks like they can fly because of their flippers, but.
Okay, I guess this is the best place to ask that. So as I was assembling these questions, I was a bit hesitant to ask you about that New Yorker piece.
We're in Albany. Anything goes here.
What the hell? But then I saw you tweet out an Instagram DM you had received from the producers of the podcast, Our Struggle. And let me just pause here to say that the sentence that I just said sounds like it's out of Superset True Love Story.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And and they asked, we were serious about wanting to interview you about your penis and also your thoughts, if any, on Karl Ove Nausgaard. And your response was, I'll let you deliver it.
I don't even remember what it was.
Yes, let's talk penis in June.
That does sound like me too.
What I love is the if any.
Yeah,
in the
if
question,
any.
you know?
I don't really have that many feelings about Knausgaard. I mean, he's great. I mean, he's Norwegian. I'll take that at face value, you know. But the other subject I could talk quite a bit about. In fact, I've been asked to do a one-man play about that. So
Seriously?
yeah.
Do you have any interest in doing that?
I might. I mean, I feel like I'm a pretty performative person, and I've enjoyed writing all these books, but I do want to do some little tap dancing or something. Yeah.
I was reading it while on vacation, and I would read a bit of it, and I would go, "Oh God!" and everybody would go, "What? What?" I was just like, "This is so painful to read." It's
Men say that. Women were laughing and just having a great time. They're like, look what they did to a schlong.
no, I think I would disagree because
Okay.
women I know who have read that can connect to it because at some point everyone has
A penis?
everyone has a debilitating, long-lasting health condition that seems like it's almost more like a wizard's curse than anything else.
No, the worst part of it is there were times where I thought that it would never end because that was a possibility because it was such a strange thing that nobody had. I saw 12 doctors, most of them horrifying. But yes. And so I was writing about somebody with a chronic issue in Our Country Friends. And in fact, I hate to say it, but many of my very good friends have, cancer, stage 4 cancer, which, knock on wood, they've had for a long time. It's much more manageable now, certain kinds of it than others. But I've been living with, having some of the dearest people in my life be very sick, and they're exactly my age. They shouldn't be happening. And there's a kind of guilt that I've always felt toward them. But then, then I would take walks with them and Poets Walk in Red Hook. And I would tell them about my problems, and they would be like, "Oh God, Yari, this sounds way worse than anything I'm going through." No.
It does. It really does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look it up, folks, if you want a cheerful read for this weekend. I tried to make it funny, though. It's funny, right? Yeah.
It's hilarious.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really tried to make it funny. If I'm going to write about the worst pain in the world, it's got to be funny.
There are members of my household who have were very, very antsy about anything sort of that's self-revelatory. I assume that your family has just kind of gotten beyond that over the course of the last 20 years.
No, they're still very angry.
I would imagine that New Yorker piece might have pushed
some button. Well, push my button. Damn. I mean, but they always, it's always the same. Is this going to be good for the Jews? I'm like, nothing I write has ever been good for anyone. Jews, Armenians, Ecuadorians. I don't think in those terms. Like, who's going to come out ahead in this? But they really, that's how they're. They have a very kind of ethnic or nationalistic mindset. So, but, I know that I'll never please them with what I write. There's a lot of, if you read Little Failure, there's a lot of complications. My father wanted to be an artist. That never quite happened for him. So I think there's some tension with that. Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Our Country Friends is that I realized that my family, I have a family, my wife and son, but my other real family is the family that I've made with my friends. I think that is the overarching theme of this book, and they were my friends from, at first I went to a yeshiva, like a Hebrew parochial school, and that did not work out so well. But when I got to Stuyvesant, where, everyone made fun of me because I was the immigrant, and, I had this big woolly fur hats, and, I remember it was so bad, I kept saying, that I wasn't born in Leningrad, I was born in East Berlin, You're in a Jewish school, you're telling people you're German. That was better than being Russian at that point. Still might be, right? But then when I got to this high school where everybody was an immigrant, that was the first time I really felt good, and I was able to make friendships, and because we all had this memories of the accent and all that other stuff. So I kind of wanted to both celebrate that in this book, but also, put in that kind of Chekhovian, oh God, we're 50, I didn't accomplish this, she didn't accomplish that. And also everyone's falling in love and having sex with each other, and as people do of my generation. I teach writing at Columbia, and I'm always shocked that some of the, my younger students, they're in their 20s, early 20s, and it's like sex doesn't even exist for them, mean, unless it's virtual or emoji based somehow. That's really interesting for me. I'm like, because my generation, I'm like, damn, we didn't have, I guess, the internet back then. So.
We're roughly the same age. You're a little bit younger than I am, but of course we came of age just as the AIDS epidemic was kind of crossing over from being, it was perceived by many back then to be exclusively a problem in the gay community, to the sort of Magic Johnson cutoff point where all of a sudden it was seen as being a problem for everyone.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not that people obviously were scared of AIDS. I remember, getting tested, and then back then it was this big thing, like, are you, or is your whole life about to change? But I think we also had, I don't know, there was more of I mean, people were having it more. It feels like, I could be wrong, but actually statistics bear out that high school, et cetera, people are having it a lot less, and there isn't an AIDS-like crisis at this time, right? So I think it's more of a question of what people want from it, what they're getting or not getting from it, or what they're getting somewhere else that is like that. I really do think, and I was doing some research for a project, that they really are coming up with robotic sexual partners. I know this sounds very sci-fi, but it will happen in my lifetime, I think, if I live a little longer than 74. And this will be a gigantic market, trillions of dollars. In fact, this may supplant sex with actual human beings. So my friends who are of my generation, and they have kids who are already in their 20s or something, and they're all using Tinder and all that, and they always say, we're the last people. Think of us as the last people to get off that roof in Saigon, before all this electronization of sex began.
Well, and the fact that in the community and our country friends, there are various relationships and coupling that goes on. In that sense, I guess you have written a dystopian novel that reminds us that even in a dystopia, there is still love and friendship and yearning and all that good stuff. And is it fair to say that in this you have written almost a utopian novel that reminds us that even in utopia things can be miserable and trouble?
Sure.
People yell at each other.
I mean, in some ways, the novel, there are parts of the book where I write as sort of almost the happiest Shteyngart novel you will ever read. There's just people, there's a woman who never wanted to have a child, who finds this girl who is the daughter of Senderovich and his wife Masha, and she just falls in love with her. This is sort of she sees her almost as a replacement, as who she was when she was a little kid, and they form this almost mother-daughter bond. I've never written stuff like that in my life, because usually it's all very satirical and what have you. But there's also, the dystopia. There is an electronic element in this book. There's an app called True Emotions that makes people fall in love with each other. It's sort of algorithm driven, and it wreaks havoc for some of the characters. One of the characters gets canceled in the book because of something she writes on Twitter. So
a character named D. Cameron, which is
the Cameron.
a getaway.
Yeah. Oh, academic humor. Yeah. So there's always, and of course, something terrible does happen toward the end of the book, but there are moments where almost every character sees something, achieves something, finds out something new, which is not the way I usually write. For me, literary fiction is just, depressing people doing depressing things.
With that,
Sorry, but not this book. No.
I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience if and we have a microphone down here.
Oh, good.
That we can hand around. If you'll raise your hand.
Question about place names. It may be trivial or it may be more significant. You write the entire book without using any. I don't think you even use the term Hudson River. And so for those of us who know Mid-Hudson Valley, it becomes a really fun guessing game. It could even be a drinking game.
It could be a drinking game.
Oh,
let's do it
Otto's.
now.
Yeah,
I know it's a dry campus, but yeah.
Yeah, that's Otto's Market in Germantown.
That's Otto's. Oh, you know your stuff. All right.
Yeah. Used to live there.
Ah.
What's your thinking how big does a place have to be before you can use its name?
Yeah, thank you. That is a very good question, actually. So I've used, in my earlier incarnation, my earlier novels, I used made-up names. So the city of Prague, which is in Czech, Praha, became Prava in Russian Debutante's Handbook. A republic that doesn't quite exist, but would be sort of a cross between Georgia and Azerbaijan became Absurdistan in Absurdistan, the book. Then in Superset, I used, Superset involved two gigantic, oh, in Absurdistan, there's also a city that's constantly referred to as St. Lenin'sburg, but you know, that is obviously St. Petersburg or Leningrad or an unholy combination thereof. And then in Superset, I used Rome and New York because they're so Rome and New York. Here, I kind of go to the idea of, like in the old Russian novels, it'll be like, he lived in the village of N and then M dash, right? But I also did want to create a slightly more fantastical element to this, almost, I don't know, like fable or allegory. Not really, but more of that without the, if I said Hudson, then everybody would be like, oh, it's that trendy city that all the hedge fund people now go to, or, Kingston, to be like, oh, it's New Brooklyn or whatever it's supposed to be, So I decided to sort of not name anything, including, I really don't name the river, right? Or do I? I can't even remember. I'm sorry, it's been so long. But also, there's an actor, a famous actor, who also doesn't get named. He's just called the actor. So that is also part of that kind of technique of, also, if I named the actor, then everybody would be projecting their hatred upon this person. Whereas now it's build your own actor you think is a pretentious jerk.
That hasn't stopped people from trying to imagine who the actor is and projecting. I know I did as I read it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a huge drinking game.
And it turns out I was wrong.
You were wrong. You can go online and see all the actors I've been associated with over the years in weird, various failed projects. So that can give you a hint.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Your memoir is largely about your relationship with your parents, and I wonder if being a parent yourself now has brought you back to that, or it feels like reliving it at all.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, it's so strange. And I think in some ways I never wanted to be a parent because I've always felt that given my childhood, it just didn't feel like I could be as present and generous, maybe that's the word. I mean, that's one thing that was sort of missing. I think when I was growing up, there wasn't room for generosity. We didn't have, my parents worked day and night. They also had a difficult assimilation to this country, as did I, but theirs was very different. We did not get along almost ever. There are parts of the memoir that bring up that sense of joy that sometimes has, but it was, sort of, those things almost jump out, so I didn't think I would have any, I didn't think I had any business being a father, and I was pretty, how old was I? Somebody knows math. 49 minus 8 is 41, yeah. See, all that math and science high school did not work out for me. It was 41, which, I guess nowadays happens a lot, but it still felt, but I finally felt good enough to do it. But the relationship I have with my son is now so different, obviously, than the one that I had with my parents. And it's so strange to see him growing up, not having to go through immigration, being born in New York, speaking New Yorkian, all that stuff, and he has passions. He's as passionate about math as I was about writing back, when I was a kid. So we're very different kids. And my father, the kind of parents that I grew up with, and actually a lot of my immigrant friends grew up with, they had very concrete ideas about who a child should be and how that child should follow in their footsteps. My good friend, who's partially the character of Vinud, has something to do with him, was this Pulitzer-winning Indian journalist, and he was, his father used to say to him, what did he say? Son, you have to get an engineering degree because you have low body mass or something, and no woman will ever love you. low muscle tone, and no woman will ever love you. So you have to go to a good school and get an engineering degree. I mean, what? But that was my parents all the time. And, that's one reason I think we always bonded is because it was that was the advice you got, And I think in some ways, the earlier part, my attempt at parenting, not exactly parenting, was first, and like all Russian children, I was an only child. Russians don't, breed in captivity or something. But we had, it's almost the immigrant friends I had, we became each other's siblings and almost parents, like everybody did something. Since I was the writer, I wrote everyone's resumes and cover letters. A friend of mine went shopping with me so I wouldn't, look like a dork, and she'd pick out the clothes for me and stuff like that. And that was almost like a pre-parenting experience. And then when my son was born, it was more like trying to access those feelings instead of the feelings of the original family from which I come from, And this is not me insulting them. I think they did their best, but there's just so much that they could do coming from the land of Stalin and Hitler, in terms of my father, whose father was killed by Hitler. And they couldn't quite keep up with what life required of them as parents, and that's so I didn't want to have a kid until I could realize that I could do that for my own kid, but I was already pretty long in the tooth when that happened.
Hi, you've already spoken a bit to this peculiar combination of utopian, dystopian, and writing in the present, and the combination of all of that with this book. And during a year where the basics were shifting under our feet from one month to the next, I was wondering if that presented you with particular challenges, and if there was a way to work with that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, it was challenging, but here's what I do with, traumatic global events is you make sure that they're tied into characters. So with this book, the thing that I thought was, somebody at the previous appearance I just did here asked, what do you like the most about the book? Which is a horrible question to ask an author. We're supposed to be so self-effacing. The cover, that's the best thing about the book. But what I did was I tried that everything that happened was filtered through their personality, so that I would have to go in very close, a close third, as they call it in writing terms. You have your omniscient third person narrator, but I don't even know how to genderize it, goes really close into the minds of each character. And I tried to be as generous as I could with them in a way that I wasn't when I was a young writer, when I was just a satirical, angry writer, angry at my parents, angry at society, angry at the Moyle, just angry. More about that on the internet. But when you grow older, you become, especially, and having to go back to the question you just asked, having a child does do that in terms of writing. You become slightly more, I don't want to say mellow, because I'm angry at the world that my kid's going to inherit. That's not the world that I wanted him to inherit. I mean, not from me, but from, the burning planet. And it's not the planet's fault. Sorry, you know what I'm saying. But yeah, I going into their consciousness allowed me to sort of be like, okay, George Floyd, right? How is each of them going to feel about that? So some people are going to be like, oh, I'm on Twitter all the time, so I'm going to, not monetize that because Twitter doesn't pay you shit. But I'm going to do something to, increase my social capital, right? And another person would think of it, and then Sasha was kind of a buffoonish character, really takes this to heart, and you kind of go into his mindset for that, right? So the only way we can process the future is by creating characters for whom we can feel something, I think, because we all experience everything now as a global community, whether it's global change or pandemics, or I mean, even this war is already becoming in some ways a world war. There's only two sides fighting so far, but we're all sort of been deputized to feel something about it in a way that I think hasn't happened in previous generations. But if I was to write, which I am going to write about Ukraine, it'll only be through, I think, the lens of maybe 3 generations of grandparents born in Russia or Ukraine, parents, 1.5 generation, and then the second generation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's really enjoying the book.
Oh, thank you.
And there's something you said earlier, and it really reverberated with the feeling I get in the book. And that, as you said, you went to Oberlin College.
Mm.
What did that do for you in your writing?
Are you an OB? Yes. Oh, good, good. I love the OC. Yeah, I mean, Oberlin was very important to me. I think there's two steps in my life that were very important. So I was growing up in this very parochial, very conservative, family and Hebrew school, etc. We never went into Manhattan. In fact, I thought that some of the buildings in Queens, that was the Manhattan skyline. That's how sheltered I was, But then I did go to that school in Manhattan, which did two things. It allowed me to make a diverse group of friends who were more my kind of people. They were immigrants. But it also introduced me to Manhattan and to the idea that life could be a little bit more involved than what was happening in that little community where I was from, where we only spoke Russian. We had very set political beliefs. All of that was challenged by Manhattan. And the second part of that, of my evolution, I think, was Oberlin. And it was as simple as there was a teacher there, a professor of creative writing, and she kind of picked me out of the choir and said, you can do this. You can do this. And it being Oberlin, it was, it wasn't even a class. I spent 3 years working with her one-on-one. I'd write 100 pages of my first book, and we'd spend months going through them with a fine-tooth comb and figuring out what was working and not. And then, I don't think that would have happened in too many other institutions. I'm sure there's some others, but also Oberlin, is interesting because I was growing up and all I wanted, we were poor immigrants. All I wanted to do was like get to Wall Street and make a fortune. I remember watching Wall Street and being like, that's how it's done. I didn't even get the point in the end that he was arrested. I was like, well, maybe you don't get caught, But in Oberlin, being an artist was the thing to be. It was being anything other than that, or somehow helping society, social work, academia, etc. That was considered. Those were considered the important things to do, and everything else, making money, was seen as something awful, which was interesting because some of the kids clearly had some money. But that was part of the the tension, I guess. I live now right near Bard, where there are also some very interesting cars on this plate. Anyway, but all of those contradictions are, I think, important to me and have always been important to me. And I think are kind of the moment too. In a weird way, Oberlin kind of defines part of the moment we live in, because a lot of the things that you see now, which you may or may not like, were sort of, I remember us sort of testing that out in the very early 90s, late 80s, especially identity politics. So being there was strange, but kind of very useful. But I have to say also 3 years in Ohio, you pay the price. You're oh my God, I almost transferred out first year because I just couldn't take the food. It was disgusting. And if I hadn't fallen in love with this woman, who then became my first real girlfriend, I would have transferred and gone to NYU, and then I really would have written that dystopian novel. Yeah. Yeah.
Probably got time for maybe just one more.
So, important question, I guess, pandemic cocktail of choice,
Oh,
and
yeah.
connected to that, what do you think the role of food and drink is in your writing? You
Yeah.
post a lot on Instagram and social media about what you eat and drink. It often looks
First of all,
amazing. So
social media has destroyed my life, but thank you for following me on social media. At Shteyngart on Twitter or Instagram. Check it out. No, I'm kidding. I'm not kidding though, please. This is my whole life. I love food. God, I love food. I love drink. God, I love drink. My mother, God bless her, she tried to cook, but it was this very Soviet cuisine. They would take a piece of vegetable and just interrogate it, as we say now in academia. They would interrogate it. They would put electrodes on it. They would bleed it. And then that would be served with a piece of meat that was also assaulted in terrible ways. So when I discovered real food, and I remember where it was a place called El Faro in Greenwich Ave and Jane Street in the West Village. It was a Galician restaurant, Galicia is in Spain, hence the lisp. Incredible, mariscada and green sauce. It was, I think, the first time I ever tasted garlic, which does not grace much of the Russian palate. Oh God, it was good. And then shrimp al ajillo, more garlic. And then you dipped something into it. I can't remember what, maybe my hand. and I was moved. And then the sangria that they would serve us, even though we were clearly underage. I fell in love. I mean, it was, as sensuous to me as anything else, And sometimes I think that my food scenes are way more sexy than my horrifying sex scenes. But I loved it. And during the pandemic, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book in 6 months, as opposed to the usual 4 years, is there was no one to drink with, because, I was sort of stuck, and my wife doesn't drink much. I tried with my 8-year-old, but he was not interested for some reason. He was 5 at the time. So, okay, maybe next year in Jerusalem. So that encouraged me to write a lot more. But then we did form a pod with some of my friends when people began to do that kind of, half-mast thing toward the end of August. And I got into Gibsons a lot. That became my pandemic drink. The Gibson is, of course, it's almost like a martini, but there's a cocktail onion used instead of any of the other garnishes. The cocktail onion does not, and I love onions, as you know, but it doesn't add that much flavor. It actually has less flavor than olives would. And somehow that feels appropriate for the times we are living in. And then we made a lot of lamb steak, as I was just reading in the book. There's a great, the two, you may know the two, it's Sawkill is the name of the meat company, and they're really gorgeous, two young, gorgeous people who make that. And then my friend came up and made vitello tonato, but he does it with green beans. So there's a great, so if you haven't bought the book yet, the writing, whatever, the recipes are primo, just beautiful. A lot of really good eating. And I thank people in the back for their recipes. And yeah, so, and this is really, like I said, this is a great, and the profile that the Times Union did of me was one of my favorites. I can't remember who was the site. Yeah, it was just really, she really nailed it.
Alexandra Zissou.
Yes, yeah. She did such a great profile. So that made me feel like I really do feel less and less of a New Yorker these days. And, my kid goes to school down there, but in 10 years he won't. And then, then it will be like permanent mid-Hudson Valley time. And I'll be eating those lamb steaks every day. If lamb still exists, then,